right. Okay. So then I'm going to get started. Basically, I call this startup Odyssey because I've had quite a long journey, and what I wanted to do is to expose what led me to have the fascination with equity crowdfunding. So that having been said, let's see how this thing all ultimately transpired. Okay, so essentially, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I started off originally in 1982 with an import business for pet cages. Then in '83, learned very quickly that promotional products was a better way to go because they're smaller. So I started two companies, one a distributorship and one an importer. Then moved on to Europa Watch as a customized watch producer. Logistics, which was my first software company to make office automation software. iTime for individual customized watches. Europa ILC to create a brand. Time Expressions for high-tech customized watches. And SecureCC, which was my first social mission software company. eShocks for e-commerce software. NextRX, and finally NextPitch in 2016. Now, what they all had in common is that they were all bootstrapped. And the reason for that is that there really wasn't much of a choice, at least not until 2016. So basically, that's when I decided for NextRX, which does medical marijuana patient management software, that equity crowdfunding would be a cool next development. So that having been the case, basically the opportunity that is now available to actually raise potentially, well, at least $1 million from thousands of fuelers, many of whom are likely to become brand ambassadors or even customers of the startup, and to do this on very favorable terms. As I say, what's not to like? So basically, we took what we had for NextRX, which was the RX Pass, and we went ahead and prepared to launch on StartEngine on the first day. As a matter of fact, NextRX was one of the first 17 campaigns on the very first day that equity crowdfunding was legal. Great, exciting stuff. So I said to myself, well, this is great. Why is it important to be one of the first? Well, if you're one of the first of a whole new industry, or at least industry segment, there's a high probability that you're going to get exposure. And that was certainly what I was counting on. And the fact that it happened to be connected in an indirect way or in an ancillary fashion with the medical marijuana space made it that much more appealing, because that was really hot at the time. However, be careful what you wish for. Basically, what happened is that because of that very connection to the cannabis space, the escrow bank for StartEngine decided to pull the campaign. And so it was taken down after 2 days because they couldn't process the transactions. And lo and behold, that's when I got my news exposure in the LA Times business section. But as you can see, hopes for a pot startup flame out. Well, that wasn't what I was hoping for. So that, however, did not end up discouraging me unduly from the concept and the excitement behind equity crowdfunding. And so basically I created NextPitch, the idea being the next generation of pitching, where instead of the typical demo day, the idea would be for startups, in effect, to have live equity crowdfunding campaigns so that the audience can take part, not just accredited investors. So here's a video that I created for a campaign that I prepared on WeFunder for the end of 2016, except ironically enough, the cannabis stuff came back to haunt me there too, because WeFunder would not accept the campaign because they were afraid there was a connection with cannabis. It didn't matter how much I told them that there's no connection other than me, in the sense that I founded both. So here is the video that explains the vision.
Remember these? Twitter, Tesla, GoDaddy, I do. Facebook's IPO, second largest IPO of all time. Square priced where the bankers suggested that companies I could invest in, because investing was restricted to the elite venture capitalists. The public was left out in the cold. That is, until the Regulation CF part of the Jobs Act became active in early 2016. But even then, there was another problem. What were the best equity crowdfunding campaigns? Where could I find them? That is why I created Next Pitch. Next Pitch is a new event series dedicated to showcasing innovative crowdfunding campaigns at a single event. These are campaigns that you can invest in directly today. At each event, we showcase campaigns exclusively through their campaign videos. Within the Next Pitch app, the audience can rate each campaign and even support them, or flow them as I like to call it, through non-linear indications of interest. At the end, the results are displayed for all to see the verdict of the crowd. The goal of Next Pitch is to help the crowd discover, rate, and support the latest generation of entrepreneurs and to help fuel their dreams and visions. We believe equity crowdfunding can be a new source of funding for startups between friends and family and angels. That's why it's called Next Pitch. It's the next generation of pitching. Does that mean we're investing in the next Facebook? Maybe, but that's not the point. We're looking for the crowd to fuel our goal for Next Pitch to become the definitive monthly showcase for innovative startup campaigns. Our revenue model is simple: profit from ticket sales and sponsorships, and ultimately television broadcasting rights. We want to build a global audience where we can see startups reach their funding goals right at the event and inspire a new generation of entrepreneurs. So please contribute to our campaign and let's fuel tomorrow's future today.
So that was definitely a second. Okay. Exciting stuff, except unfortunately, obviously it was not accepted, and it's a bit dated by now, but you get the idea. So in conjunction with that, I created an app called eCrowdfunder. And the app, or the purpose of the app, is for the individuals to literally be able to stay on top of the market and to select their own favorites and to both rate and, if they're so inclined, actually invest in the campaigns. So it's a very exciting field. So we started off making these events. This is kind of what it looked like for the thing. And ultimately, what we want to do is to bring it totally and utterly online, because that's the only way that makes sense. Let me see if this works here. So the intent is basically for the audience to have the app, go into the app and see, for example, whatever the latest show is in effect. And when they actually get to a point that they say, oh, wow, I like this particular campaign, click on a button, be able to actually see the campaigns, and of course, indeed, look at their campaign and rate them themselves on the spot. And that is really what makes this thing rather unique, because this level of interactivity does not otherwise currently exist. So now let's take a look at the traditional funding sources for startups. We're all familiar with friends and family. That's great. The only problem with friends and family is that if the business fails, and traditionally 9 out of 10 businesses fail, the relationship suffers as well. Then, of course, you had angel investors, usually successful individuals that have had their exit, but basically want to be involved, at least indirectly. And if you have a sufficiently exciting prospect, you can try for VC or venture capital, but that is really pretty much out for most startups. What is exciting to me is that basically with equity crowdfunding, you have a whole new level of funding possibilities for early stage startups. And that basically is where CF comes in. Regulation CF, or crowdfunding, basically is for unaccredited investors. Now, of course, accredited investors are also welcome to partake, but it is a fact that it is open to unaccredited investors that makes it so important and interesting. So, some considerations: the startup has to be legally registered company in the US or Canada. So this fact that the companies have to be legally registered means that you're not getting the startups from founders that woke up one morning and said, oh, I'm going to make the next great company or whatnot, but don't really go through the steps. So in other words, the startups have to be serious entities, and that means that as a result, you have a lot higher success rate compared to regular crowdfunding. The minimum campaign length is 21 days. However, the maximum is not set. Unlike Kickstarter or Indiegogo, you can actually extend the deadline repeatedly. I've seen one campaign called Mod Vans on StartEngine, which literally ran just about for 2 years. Now, the good news for them is that during that time, even though they started off fairly slow, they actually reached the max. In other words, 1,070,000. So good for them, although, boy, that was an endless number of extensions. The maximum that you can raise is 1,070,000 per year, although that may be increased to 5 million by the end of this year or by next year. If that were to happen, that really is a game changer, because the important part is that this is per year. When you're talking about that kind of money, that's a very different game compared to what it is right now even. Now, all campaigns must file a Form C with the Security and Exchange Commission. However, unlike other campaigns like Reg D or Reg A+, etc., the SEC does not review the filings. They do store them and make them accessible and available to the public, but they're not reviewed. This is very, very important, because the whole intent for regulation crowdfunding is, while on the one hand, they want to protect the investor, to be sure, at the same time, you don't want to make it unduly burdensome. If the SEC had to review all the individual docs and go back and forth, that would be a very different game. So this is a very, very important feature. Now, at the same time, these campaigns can only be run on platforms that are approved and have registered with the SEC. So you can't do this on your own, as it were. You must use one of the approved platforms. Finally, startups must provide certified financials for a campaign of 107,000. Certified means certified by one of the officers, usually the CEO of the startup, that he or she merely certifies that the accounts are, or the accounting is appropriate. However, if you want to go for the big ticket, in other words, over $500,000 actually, you must have reviewed financials for the startup, which of course is rather more expensive. So what often happens is that startups go for the lower level, and if they reach or come close to the 107,000, then in effect they use some of the funding that is often released to them by the platforms when they've reached that level to pay for the reviewed financials, so that they can go on to the big picture there. It's very fascinating. But what is perhaps one of the best aspects of equity crowdfunding is that anyone from anywhere can invest up to $2,200 or more, of course, if you're accredited. In other words, your audience is not local. Your audience is global, even if the campaign can only be in the US or Canada. And equally importantly, perhaps, is that you're talking about a very different kind of an investor here. The focus is really on the word crowd rather than funding, meaning you're looking to build a crowd of relatively modest investments, $100, $200, but you just need enough of them. After all, 1,000 times $100 adds up very nicely too, as opposed to getting a very big check from one individual. So, what types of equity exactly are being sold? Well, you have typical common stock, whether it's Class A or B without voting rights. That's what we all expect. Then, of course, you have preferred stock, and you have membership units or LLC units if it happens to be an LLC. That's all pretty much run-of-the-mill. However, increasingly, you're also starting to see revenue share, in other words, debt, as well as convertible notes, and most importantly of late, because this has really taken off, is an idea that was pioneered by Y Combinator. Y Combinator is an accelerator or incubator, I'm not quite sure which, in Silicon Valley. And they had a major problem. The problem was that when they selected startups for their program, they usually invested, I believe it was $120,000. But how exactly do you get a valuation that makes any sense for a startup that typically doesn't have a whole lot of revenue, if any, not to mention all the other metrics that are usually used in the valuation process? So they developed the SAFE as effectively a convertible note with a trigger. And what the SAFE would basically say is, yes, we'll pay 100,000 or 120 or whatever it is. And at the time of the investment, we are not getting anything. However, when you go to your first seed round and you have a priced round, at that time, the trigger kicks in, so that whatever the terms of the SAFE are, in other words, whether you're getting common stock, preferred stock, or whatever it happens to be, is then executed together with any discounts that may have been built in to compensate for the higher risk at the early stage. This is a big, big deal for this industry. And you can also, for a while, when cryptocurrency was rather hot, they did the same thing with the SAFT, or simple agreement for token, the same concept. So this was really a big development. So let's take a look at how this industry has actually grown over the years. Started off on May 16, 2016, and with a pretty modest 144 campaigns and raising 25 million. That was not exactly overwhelming, but by 2017, they're already at 69 million. That's pretty substantial. And perhaps more importantly, the number of investors that increased at 78,000. And I should point out, by the way, in these numbers here, which come from NextPitch, we are only taking the information that's available from the platforms. In other words, if a platform has a campaign and they show 500 investors, that's the number that we'll take for that campaign. The fact that many of those investors may actually, or some at least, will also be showing up for other campaigns is not, if you will, separately counted. So nevertheless, it gives us a pretty good idea of where this puppy is headed. So going forward to 2019, we're already looking at 478 campaigns, which interestingly enough is of course considerably less than the 2018. However, if you look at the total amount raised, that is considerably more. What that therefore tells you is that not only are the number of investors or fuelers growing, but more importantly, the amount that the campaigns are raising is gradually increasing. This is particularly pronounced in 2020, which of course is still in the process. The numbers that you see here are valid as of 8/7, i.e. yesterday. And you can tell that as of right now, the number of campaigns is again higher at 527, but most importantly, we're already at 73 million, which means that by the end of the year, we'll probably be around 130 to 140, maybe even 150 million. That is pretty exciting stuff. So the projections for 2021 are obviously just that, projections based upon the past. But what really matters is that it's an industry that's clearly on the move. So the total raised since 2016 has actually come to 371 million, which is pretty substantial, not to mention from over 500,000 investors with over 2,300 campaigns. That is definitely an industry that is going places. So let's take a quick look at who are the players. And in this case, we have, for 2020, the top 10 players. Most important is that you'll notice on the dark blue side is the cumulative results for all time, as opposed to the light blue, which shows you only the results for this, in this case, year 2020. And it stands out that the top 3 platforms are WeFunder, StartEngine, and Republic. And then it drops like a rock. So seed invest at 3 million, you know, compared to 16 for Republic is pretty modest. Microventures, even half of that basically, and net capital at 1.3 and so forth. So the bottom 8 players or 7 players don't contribute a whole heck of a lot in relation to the big boys. In other words, Republic, StartEngine, and WeFunder are the equivalent of Kickstarter and Indiegogo. But what is really significant is to look at the amounts that are raised, especially in this year compared to the years past, which is getting to be very, very substantial, not to mention the number of fuelers that they're putting in place. So here, let's check out what it is that, if there is a specialization, what that looks like. On the left-hand side, you basically have campaign shots from some of the majors. Microventures doesn't really quite belong there, but I thought that was such a cool design there for this windcraft aviation that I decided to put it in there. The important part is for you to see what kind of information you typically get to see on the respective campaign pages. It is up to the platform to, of course, inform you as to what the general conditions are, what the results are, and so forth. And I just noticed that 2 of the campaigns actually are just about, well, at the limit. That was not actually intentional. It just happened because I happened to like those particular campaigns and what they stood for. No, most of them, of course, do not go up to $1 million. However, very significantly, in the case of StartEngine, for instance, you can see not only the number of investors and how many days there are still left, but also the all-important, arguably, pre-money valuation, which, as often as not, seems to be taken out of a hat. But that's a separate matter. And then the price per share, as well as what it is that you're buying, and the minimum investment, which, by the way, is typically $100, but is starting to edge up, especially on StartEngine. Most important, though, is that what is it that the main platforms seem to be offering? And typically it is either shares, convertible notes, or safes, where, of course, the safe is a kind of convertible note as well. What is notable, however, is that there's a separate segment of the industry that basically works with debt and revenue share. And you can see 2 of those campaigns on the right, or platforms that specialize in this, like Honeycomb, Fundopolis, Mainvest, Next Seed, and Buy the Block. And going back to the previous screen, you may notice that none of those happen to be on that screen. That isn't just because I personally don't particularly care for it, but it's because the results that they're obtaining so far are not very impressive. Now, that may change because, unlike the stuff on the left, when you have debt or revenue share, then at least the return is written in stone, so to speak. Whether you actually literally will get it is another matter. But you can think of it more like the equivalent of a bank account with interest, as opposed to a rather speculative one where you do not get any ongoing interest. So it's fascinating to see the industry moving in both directions, although in the last couple of months, I've also started to see some of these revenue or debt campaigns on StartEngine, for example, and WeFunder. So it's fascinating to see that they're playing with different variables of the same idea. Now, this industry is definitely starting to get national attention. Basically, Mr. Wonderful, as he likes to be called, has tied up with StartEngine. And that is really starting to add some serious credibility to equity crowdfunding. And the irony is that in all probability, with the exception of StartEngine itself, he probably has never actually made an investment in an equity crowdfunding campaign, for the simple reason that the terms, if nothing, are not to his liking. After all, he is a shark. But that doesn't stop him from basically recognizing the dynamic growth of the industry. At the same time, people like John Nigerian, I beg your pardon, I don't know how to pronounce it, or Kevin Harrington, also one of the original sharks, have been tied into Republic, for example. So the important part is that the industry is really starting to get recognized more and more in the public sphere. And that is ultimately good news, even though there are also these snake oil salesmen like Neil Patel, who I fear are not doing a service to the industry, because what they're really pushing is the idea of a 30x return or 10x return, which in most cases is totally and utterly unrealistic. In fact, there have been very, very few exits from any companies, even though now it's been over 4 years. There have been some, but nothing that is particularly spectacular that I'm aware of. And in any case, what is really important to my mind is that the investors better understand that the risks are super high. So why invest in an equity crowdfunding campaign in the first place, if the chances are that your investment is going to essentially disappear? Well, what you're really investing in is a vision. And something which I like to think of as being very American: give them a break. Give somebody a chance. The whole point is that if you're investing $100 or $200, well, it's glorified dinner, but it's not your life savings. And that is the important part behind this, that the amount of money that is being able to be raised by the startups can become substantial. But the relative risk of the investors is high, but therefore the amount is also typically low, except that the startup, of course, gets the benefit of having both the funding as well as the potential brand ambassadors from the investors. So that is really kind of a game changer, especially when this thing increasingly starts to go online, as we're trying to do with Next Pitch. Now, there are some very interesting developments over the last couple of years that have taken place from some of the platforms. So for Republican Microventures, they not only used the safe, but they created a thing called a crowd safe. What on earth is that? Well, the problem is that typically, even with the safe, the whoever invests ultimately should, in effect, become a shareholder. What that means is that basically you're going to be on the cap table, or capital table, meaning the shareholder table. That has some huge problems. So they created a special debt vehicle, which basically combines all of the equity crowdfunding investors into a single entity. And this single entity is the entry on the cap table. Who cares? Well, the startup cares, because if you have a startup with, let's say, 1,000 individual shareholders, no reputable investment company or VC will give you the time of day, simply because of the complexity running that. However, if you have thousands potentially of investors as a single entry on your cap table, that's a big deal. In other words, just one entry. So together with your serious investors, original investors, and so on, it might be a handful, 10, 20, what have you. That means you continue to be eligible to get angel or VC funding, while otherwise they tend to look down on equity crowdfunding, though that may change in the future. Now, StartEngine has started to prepare for a secondary market in 2020. This is a really big deal. Why? Because when you invest in an equity crowdfunding campaign, for a start, you have to keep your investment for 1 year by law. You can't even sell it to your brother. But what happens after that year? Well, yes, you can sell it, except to whom, other than a relative or friend, there is no market. In other words, there is no liquidity for the investment. However, with the advent of a secondary market, that can change. So as they express themselves, they want to build a NASDAQ for private companies. Wow, that can be a game changer. So it provides liquidity for early investors, but unfortunately, from my perspective, it is really ideal for Reg A+, which in turn is what successful graduates of Reg CF are likely to move into. To put this into perspective, Reg A+ is also for both accredited and unaccredited investors, but with a maximum of 20 million at the lower level or even 50 million at the higher level. That is slated to be increased to 75 million. But because it's a totally higher rate, the complexity of the filing, legal fees, etc., is a whole different animal. So the probability is that most of the campaigns that are likely to be listed on StartEngine secondary are likely to be not CF, but A+. I mean, it doesn't exist yet, so we'll have to find out. But regardless, the fact that all of this is accessible to unaccredited investors is ultimately a huge change and something that I'm very excited about. Now, if you're interested in equity crowdfunding based on what I've just told you, there are 3 sites that I can certainly recommend for you to check out. And you have the domain right underneath it. Primarily, we're talking about King's Crowd, which is seeking to become the morning star, if you will, of equity crowdfunding, and does an excellent job of listing pretty much all of the active campaigns. They are looking to get a subscription, which is very affordable, and then you can have your own portfolio there, but they also evaluate the campaigns. So that is one area that you should certainly look into. The other one is thesabr.com, spelled S-A-B-R, which basically does the, or helps you with the due diligence for campaigns. This is probably more relevant for people who are looking to put more money into equity crowdfunding than a couple $100. And, you know, depending on your situation, there's nothing wrong with that. All that matters is that ultimately it should not really be a major part of your portfolio, maybe up to 10% or whatnot. Important part is you better assume you're going to lose your money, even if that is not the objective. And, you know, but if you want to look at it seriously, that might be the way to do it. And then ultimately we have Crowdwise, which is an absolutely superb site that basically provides all kinds of information on equity crowdfunding, but from the investor's point of view. In my case, I definitely look at it from the startup's point of view, which is decidedly different. So these are 3 sites that I can highly recommend for you to check out to learn more about equity crowdfunding. And that pretty much concludes my presentation, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that, that you have. I'm going to stop the share. How do I do that? Okay. All right. Okay. So, do we have any questions there?
I have a question, if I may.
Sure, of course.
Hey, Ralph. So, first of all, thanks for the presentation. It was great. I'm putting myself into the shoes of a startup entrepreneur, and I just, I'm working on my product, my service, and whatnot, and I need funding, and certainly don't know any angel investors, and I'm way too small without traction, so I'm not going to get any VC interested in me. So this equity crowdfunding thing looks quite promising, but I have no idea where to start. So what do I do? How do I get started on this?
Oh, it's an excellent question. Basically, step one, once you've decided that that's a direction that you want to take, is of course to select the right platform. Well, what the hell is the right platform? Does that simply mean the biggest one or the ones that's likely to have the biggest traction? It may or it may not. Let me give you an example. In my case, for example, when NextRX was declined on StartEngine, basically a year in 2017, if I remember correctly, a new platform came out called Fundana. They should have really been called Fundcana, but the point is that they specialize in cannabis campaigns. So it's kind of like, oh, wow, that's what you do? I happen to have something, I just need to dust it off. Let's try it on there. So at that time, for me, that was a very obvious choice for that particular scenario. But that having been said, in many cases, it really is a question of deciding what do you need, who are you addressing, and above all, what is it that you want to give up? As I said, there are quite a few, especially smaller businesses, that are going with platforms like Mainvest and Honeycomb that are definitely and decidedly going the debt route. And sorry about the background noise, I can't stop that. That is a very different route. And I have to say they're not being particularly successful, but it also means that for the founder, you're not giving up that many shares. Now, as a rule of thumb, you are indeed probably best off using one of the main platforms. And the primary reason for that, if nothing else, is the amount of exposure. You can tell by the number of investors or fuelers from the previous graphics that it makes a huge difference. If you're listed on a platform where the exposure goes to hundreds of thousands of people rather than a handful in relative terms for obvious reasons. So that alone, not to mention in some cases the credibility, can greatly add to it. But even once you've decided on the platform, the irony is that you probably would be very well advised to have, I would like to say, about 40 to 50K available for the campaign, which sounds counterintuitive. It's kind of like, now, don't you understand? I'm trying to raise money, not spend it. But what one critical component of every successful campaign just about is to have a kick-ass video. You better have a video that really tells your story as effectively as possible. Now, beyond the video, you still need a marketing budget to really get the word out. And in this case, I would say something like in the neighborhood of 30,000, which is a hell of a lot of money for an early stage startup. So if you happen to have those and are willing to spend them, then basically the probability of you actually raising a substantial amount up to the maximum is actually quite good. And it is interesting that way more than half the campaigns succeed. By succeed, however, I mean that they pass their minimum. Each platform sets its own minimums. StartEngine, rather wisely in my opinion, sets their minimums typically at $10,000, while Republic and WeFunder tend to be at 25 at the beginning and often go as high as 50 or 75 or 100 or even more. I don't personally like that so much because I find it incredibly unfortunate when you have a campaign that has already got 98,000 of commitments, but guess what? 120 was their minimum, so they don't make it. Now, they can try to extend it to be sure, so it's not all lost, but still, that seems to me is not very effective. But in any case, so select the platform, and above all, make sure you have the funding to really run a professional campaign. And then the chances of success actually are very high. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thanks. Are there any consultants or any firms that can assist with this? Because again, as a founder, I might want to just focus on my product and not be out there doing the analysis and creating the video, overseeing the production of the video and writing up the profile and all the legwork that's required.
Yes, there are. Not ironically enough, there's no big name that I'm aware of in equity crowdfunding in particular at this time. Now, that I suspect is going to start to change. In fact, I believe there may be a movement afoot to start to create incubators that ultimately are looking to replace the demo day with the launch day. In other words, forget about the accredited investors. Never mind, your startup's goal is actually to have a launch day, meaning launch of the campaign, obviously. And the purpose is to prepare the startup for that first and foremost. And that will include certainly all of the necessary connections, such as the advertising and movie production and so on and so forth. But no, I'm not aware of a company that really stands out. There was one that came to mind, I want to say John Long or whatever, but I don't remember. It doesn't stand out yet, but that may very well change.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Any other questions from anybody else that I would be more than happy to address?
Gonzalo speaking. Are you hearing me right now?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you. How to choose what to give in the campaign, if it is equity, if it is, there is a lot of terms that most of the people don't understand and don't know what they are giving.
Excellent question, and you're absolutely right, of course. This is one of the biggest problems. Just a second, I'm seem to be getting all kinds of noises here today. Basically, the core question, first of all, is the startup comfortable with giving shares? And you'd be surprised how many of them are not, which is one reason why you have the focus on the debt. Not focus, but at least the availability of the debt on the other side of the equation. But quite frankly, for the startup, they probably should, if they can, find a consultant to go over the various options before they decide what they're really comfortable with. But what I will tell you is this: from my perspective, by and large, what Republic calls the crowd safe is the obvious way to go. Simply because at the time that you're getting the funding, you're not even getting the shareholders at that moment. That only happens when it converts later on. But what really matters more than anything else is the idea that they're all in one separate legal entity, as opposed to individually on your cap table. What that means, in effect, is that, look, you're investing $100 or $200, don't expect the whole package in terms of regular shareholder rights. In fact, what's happening is that because they're being bundled into a separate company, that company actually becomes your official representative. From the startup point of view, it makes it so much easier to manage that. It's the best of both worlds, as best as I can tell. But it is certainly not as advantageous for the investor as regular stock at the time of the purchase, which is where StartEngine seems to be headed, maybe because they're secondary. So basically, you know, there may be some consultants out there. I might actually go in that direction myself. But it really has a lot to do with your level of comfort when it comes to, you know, having shareholders.
Okay, thanks for the answer. I have another question. Can the company be based on Delaware or Wyoming?
No, the Delaware, the company can be an LLC, but I highly recommend against that. The smart move, especially today, and especially if you're looking to raise money down the road in whatever form, is to have a C corporation registered in Delaware. Whether you like it or not doesn't really matter, but that is by default undoubtedly the smartest way to go. Some investors, meaning Silicon Valley ones, will absolutely require that, as crazy as it sounds. So C Corporation Delaware, and in this day and age, especially after the latest tax changes, there really is no reason anymore to have an LLC rather than a C Corporation. And the reason why C Corporation is important is because it issues shares, unlike the LLC. That's why LLCs are not really a suitable instrument, especially if what you're doing is ultimately issuing shares.
Okay, that's good, because I think in Delaware the C corporation can be from foreign, doesn't need to be a U.S. citizen. That's
oh, to register the C corporation, you mean?
Yeah.
Well,
so you can register without having to have a residency.
Yes, I see what you mean. But what I can recommend potentially is for you to look at GUST, GUST.com, or Stripe, ironically enough, Stripe, the payment processor. The important part is that both of them incorporate programs that help you, in effect, register your C corporation in Delaware very affordably and very easily and quickly, and it doesn't matter where you are. In other words, you can be in Timbuktu. It doesn't matter. So those are probably, sorry, some of the easiest ways.
Yes, I'm looking for Firstbase, firstbase.io. I think they also have that service.
Okay, I'm not familiar with them, but okay.
But what was the ones that you said? I didn't catch them.
GUST.com.
GUST. Okay.
Gust of wind.
Gust. All right. Thanks.
And otherwise, Stripe actually has an integrated stuff. The reason why Stripe is a good possibility is because in their package, obviously, you're already getting the payment processing included. That is not or as a built-in add-on. It's kind of cool. But Gust is certainly a very good way to go.
Thanks a lot. We'll look at it for sure.
Absolutely. Does anybody else have any other question that I can help you with? Well, it appears not, but in that case, I thank you very much for tuning in. I hope that you've found this to be helpful and useful, and I will hand it back to Dominic.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Ralph, for giving us a really in-depth speech for equity crowdfunding. I think before my background was more like Indiegogo and Kickstarter crowdfunding, and I helped with the event during the time when I worked in Agency 2.0, which is another crowdfunding agency. I think that one was a car, and then it's in StartEngine. And then I think it was totally another different experience, because as for Kickstarter and Indiegogo, you get physical things, right? And then usually the company or startup, they launch a campaign on Kickstarter or Indiegogo. They usually are the trends already moving, which means that Indiegogo and Kickstarter, just their marketing tool, they've already had a product launch usually, and they had a lot of budget to do the marketing, for example, like digital marketing and then social media marketing. And then I remember the company that I worked, they charge kind of like a huge amount of money to marketing for all the startups. So I kind of think that what's kind of like, because when I saw the equity campaign, I knew, because the campaign that I helped ended up to be like a fraud. So which means that they didn't really produce the product at the end for equity crowdfunding. So that's why, I mean, in Indiegogo and Kickstarter, it seems like there are some companies that kind of did a really good marketing, but at the end they didn't deliver. But during that time, I was like, wow, yeah, it's like I share a part of my company for you, but it's kind of like it's even more risk than join or buy a product for something that is about to launch. Because in Kickstarter, they have a really strict kind of like exam or like they have like 7 days for once you hit the submit button, Kickstarter team will dive into your campaign and kind of like step by step to kind of fully strictly kind of do the kind of like examination to see whether your photos are using Photoshop composite or the real product photo. I remember during that time, we are going to launch a drone campaign on Kickstarter. And then Kickstarter's people, they didn't allow us to launch. The reason why is that the photo was composite. It's not real, the drone, the real drone. And then we wrote some voice command, but in our video or in our, like the GIF file, real product demo file, we didn't show that part. So they get kind of, it took us probably 2 to 3 weeks for us to convince Kickstarter people for us to launch the drone campaign. And then the founder, Chris, he even went to a really like another mountain and flying on his own, just like flying using the real voice command on the watch. So it seems like a Kickstarter, they have a super strict restrictions for startups to launch their campaign. So that's why, and Indiegogo, they didn't, because as for Kickstarter, for example, if you set a goal, right? And then once you hit the goal, people can, the bakers, their bank account will be charged by, will be charged. But if the campaign failed, the baker won't get any charges, because if the campaign failed, it means that the owner didn't get enough money to launch the product. So Kickstarter won't charge anything. So it's more, Kickstarter is more supporting for the backer, while Indiegogo is more supporting for the founders, take startups. So yeah, once, like, no matter how much money you crowdfund, you can always take the money. And then as for equity crowdfunding, I kind of dive into a little bit. It seems like they give you a part of share and they share your vision. But since they are it's kind of like the vision part, and there's not like a product launch or any. Yeah, maybe there's some, but I would say it's probably like a more baby step than the Kickstarter or Indiegogo crowdfunding. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I would kind of like think that if I'm a backer, I would prefer to do the Kickstarter because it protects me and it has a stricter censor. So yeah, what do you think?
No, I actually think it's the other way around. If you find, even though I do not know what the statistics are actually, the number of campaigns that do not meet their minimum on Kickstarter or Indiegogo are vast. In other words, and I'm making this up, it's probably like 60% or so of the campaigns probably don't even meet their minimum. But I'd have to look at the exact ones. And the reason for that is, ironically enough, because it's so much easier, comparatively speaking, to create a campaign on Kickstarter. Now, I agree with you that they are certainly looking to maintain their reputation. I'm talking about Kickstarter and Indiegogo, And so when it comes to high-flying projects, should we say, like the drones and so on, yes, they are doing their best to make sure that it's not just a whole bunch of hype. But most of the campaigns don't have that level of kind of product. I mean, I've done a couple of Kickstarter campaigns myself. So when it comes to equity crowdfunding, because you're selling equity and because you have to have SEC-approved platforms and so on, and above all, because you have to have a company, it tends to be a lot more serious from that point of view. And it is very notable that so far, with over 2,100 or whatever it was, number of campaigns overall, I'm not aware of any campaign where there's been an assertion of fraud or what have you. You would have thought by now that would have probably happened, and I'm sure eventually it will, but it's remarkably little and or non-existent so far. And above all, the fact that it is so much more difficult to get a listing, to file that Form C, etc., tends to mean that the startups tend to be a lot more serious than, oh, I just had a great idea, let me see if I can get support for it. So, you know, that's typically my take on it. I think that equity crowdfunding tends to be more serious in this regard, at least from my experience. Now, you did mention that the company that you're talking about, that was not was it Elio Motors or something from StartEngine, that one that you worked on?
Let's see. It's kind of like a really, really high-end car, and I think they crowdfund like $5 million. Like it's one of the largest StartEngine. If you click StartEngine.
When they started off, they had a campaign for Elio Motors, I believe.
Engine, car, fraud.
It's not the end of the world. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anyone has any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Then apparently not. So that's the case. Then I will let it rest, as it were, and I thank you all for participating. And Dominic, thank you so much for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you for speaking for the event. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks. See you next.
Bye-bye.